She is known as one of America's worst female serial killers. She has many, many nicknames. The most famous one is Hell's Belle. But did her crime spree stop when people believed that it did? Can we really unravel the mystery of Belle Gunness? Well, let's put it to the pub test. G'day, I'm Owen, and we are unraveling this incredible story of the person who became known as Belle Gunness. Yes, one of America's worst female serial killers. So I'm going to break this up into about 3 parts. It's going to be one extremely long video, so we're not going to mess around much, but I will go through the story. If you have not heard this story of Belle Gunness, well, brace yourself because it is quite the interesting dive. And then we're going to look at some of the common theories. And then I will give what I really believe unravels this mystery and solves it once and for all. And I'm going to show the bits of evidence, like always, that I think a lot of people generally seem to miss when it comes to cases like this. But this is the pub test, so let me know what you think at the end of it. Would my thoughts be considered a reasonable, rational conclusion to all of this? Let's dive straight into the story. In 1859, Belle Gunness was born as Brunhild Paulsdatter, and I can't pronounce the last name, but obviously it was a Scandinavian name and she's Norwegian. So born in Norway. Now, Paulsdatter apparently just means Paul's daughter. So her father's name was Paul, and I think it's pronounced Berit is her mother. She was the last of 8 children, so she had 7 older siblings, and their life was very, very difficult. So you're living on a farm, and back in those days, it was like hand to mouth. It was abject poverty for so many of these people just trying to eke out a small living. And she worked hard, Brunhild did, on this farm. But in this story, I'm going to try and cut through some of the myths. Now, there is a general perception that Brunhild was going out with a young lad, but it was a landowner family, and she became pregnant. And so she expected marriage to take place, and that would have elevated her station in life. But it said this landowner's son was not too thrilled with the notion of marrying someone of such low class, so he beat her until she lost the baby. Now, if that story is true, that is an absolutely diabolical and tragic thing to happen to someone, and that would leave a lasting impact on your psyche. And it's said that people back in Norway believed that this is what happened to Belle Gunness, and it was a way of trying to explain some of the later events in her life. There is no evidence to support that event particularly happened. But even if it did, it certainly doesn't justify her behavior as we move forward. But it's interesting because this is perhaps the only story we get of Brunhild that sort of mitigates any of the actions she does later. In fact, a lot of the stories that we have of her, I would suggest as we go through this, are magnified, making her look even worse, if that was possible, than she actually was. And we'll be diving into that during this story as well. But the absolute reality that I believe is true is that her life in Norway was very mundane. There was nothing of significant note. But her sister Nellie had gotten married and moved to Chicago. Now, it's safe to say that Nellie was still in contact with her younger sister, or at least with the family, and so Brunhild is hearing these stories of how good life is in the United States of America. Like, you don't just have to work, sleep, and hopefully eat. No, you can go to work, you work hard, but you can have some luxuries. Things aren't that bad for you. And so Brunhild is like, I really want that American dream. I want to be able to work and see results of it. So she's pestering and badgering her sister to get the fare to come out to the United States, because there's no way for her own accord that she'd be able to afford that fare, because there is no savings plan for her. She is in poverty. She's just working to survive. And it was in 1881. So Brunhild is now 21 years old. Her brother-in-law pays the money and she's able to move out to Chicago. But an event happened in Chicago 10 years prior to this, which has a significant impact on this story. And you'll see why as we go through. But in 1871, the infamous Chicago fire happened. And in that Chicago fire, 300 people died. 100,000 people were left without a dwelling, because 17,000 structures were burned to the ground. Now, how that fire started, nobody really knows, but as always with some of these legendary stories, there's some legendary myths. And it was reported by a journalist that O'Leary's barn is where this started. So there was a lady, O'Leary, milking a cow, and somehow kicked over a bucket and a fire started in that barn, and that just devastated the whole city of Chicago. That journalist later admitted that that story was not true. The fire did start near O'Leary's barn, that is a fact, but it didn't start in there. And it was believed that the journalist put that in there to help fuel the anti-immigration message, because people were starting to feel that, maybe all these Irish people moving in isn't all that great. Yes, lots of immigrants were descending on Chicago. So it is of note that Chicago was actually the home to 20,000 Norwegian immigrants or Norwegian descendants. It was the largest community of Norwegian people outside of Norway. That is a significant number of people, and yet unlike the Irish and other immigrants that were coming into Chicago, the Norwegians had a very good reputation. Their areas of the city were kept really clean. They had the lowest crime rate of any population, of any ethnic group in all of Chicago. But just summing up about that Chicago fire, it's had such an indelible mark, that fire in 1871, that there was a TV show called Chicago Fire. I believe it was sort of a fictionalized version of that particular event that happened. And I believe the MLS, the Major League Soccer team in Chicago, is the Chicago Fire. So that's interesting. They play at Arrowhead Stadium, where the Chicago Bears, the NFL team, play. But out of the ashes from 1871, something good happened. See, they worked out this fire had three main causes. There was severe drought. There was hot, dry winds ripping through the city. And yes, Chicago is known as the Windy City. And the houses were all made of cheap timber and packed close together. And so they realized that because we can't change the conditions, we're going to get droughts, we're going to get winds, but we can improve the buildings and we can also improve our fire department. And so Chicago went through this massive transformation and invested heavily into the fire department. So it became either the best or definitely one of the best firefighting departments in the world. And I believe that is a reputation that is still held to this day. But now, if a fire started in Chicago, well, there was a very quick response. So Brunhild arrives in Chicago in 1881 and she changes her name to Bella. And then Bella begins working in domestic service. So that meant cooking, cleaning in people's houses, quite hard work. She also picks up work at a butcher's shop where part of her job is slaughtering of animals and dissecting them and chopping all the bits up. And we would think that just doesn't sound quite the role for a lady back then. We're talking 1881. Would have been hard for a woman to move into that industry. But the thing about Bella is she had the build for it. But there is a lot of myth around this person and how she really looked. But to cut through all of that, Bella was not a dainty lady by any stretch of the imagination, but she was not as grotesque as some of the reports later will show. Some people now paint that picture, and this was written after the descriptions were given after the events that happened on the farm, which we're going to get to, but they suggest that she was massively obese, over 300 pounds. That's not true. The general estimation is between 200 and 250 pound, which is about 95 to 110 kilograms. And I'd suggest it was on the lighter side of that. So more around the maybe 210 pound, maybe around the 95 kilo. Now, at 5'7", which is the best height I've seen as regards accuracy. Some people say 5'9". That would have been quite tall for a woman, or even for a bloke back in 1881, but most reports I've seen say 5'7", and it is important, that particular detail, later. But regardless, even if it was around 5'9", 5'7", at her designated weight, she would have looked very solid. But she was also extremely strong. So her going into a butcher's shop, she could handle that physical labour that would have been needed to do that job back in 1881. And no doubt she'd built up that strength and stamina from having to work so hard back in Norway on the farm. And who knows what she was accomplishing back there, because we don't have the detail of the type of farm and the work that she would have done. And another thing before we move forward, people say of Bella that her personality was a bit off. You could always tell something was not quite right. I think that is an assumption made again after the event, and people look back and make up this story. I'm not saying she was a good person. Do not get me wrong. I'm not here to defend Belle Gunness as we go through this, but I think she must have had a certain charm about her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to do what she did. But naturally, moving to a new country, even though there's a large Norwegian population, you're still making your connection. So initially, she's spending lots of time with Nellie and her family. Now, it's said that Bella was helping out with the few children that Nellie had, but Nellie got sick at one point. And so Bella was particularly looking after her 4-year-old niece. When Nellie recovered, Bella thought, well, this isn't a bad situation, and I wouldn't mind having a child. So she goes to her sister and says, is there any chance I could adopt my 4-year-old niece and she become my daughter? Well, that's a really big question to ask of someone. And at 4 years old too, I think the child might have an opinion on that. We don't know exactly what transpired there, but the answer was no. No, that is not a spare child that I'm just prepared to give away. And maybe the niece herself, obviously loves her parents. Regardless, that drove a wedge between these sisters that was never overcome. It's stated that they barely spoke, if they ever did, again after this. Yet it's not all downhill for Bella at this point. She goes shopping and runs into a bloke working at one of the shops called Mads Sorensen. Yes, he's Scandinavian as well. They hit it off. And the thing is, and this is why I say a lot of the impressions that people put forth about Bella are a misrepresentation, because Mads himself, particularly at the age he was, well, he was a fairly good-looking unit. And in that situation, in 1880s, he would have had an opportunity to marry almost anyone he wanted, and yet he ended up marrying Bella. And this marriage lasted 16 years. And Mads and Bella were doing all right for themselves. They had a house. They began adopting children. Now I say adopting because there is debate about some of this, and I'm not trying to get into every little detail, or this would go for 10 hours, this video. Now, I'm saying they were adopted because I believe Mads may have already been married to Bella when she wanted to have the niece and adopt that niece, because they couldn't have children of their own. And that was apparently a proven thing. So I can't see why she'd try and take a sister's daughter if she could have children. But it was said that after she was rejected by her sister, then she began this adoption. Unfortunately for them, a couple of these children that came into their care died from digestive issues, colitis, I believe, which was untreatable back then. It's still a terrible condition to have today. But back then also, infant mortality was through the roof. 1 in 3 children probably didn't live to the age of 5. So no suspicion really came up on Mads and Bella because losing a couple of kids. Even though they did get some insurance payouts, but that also wasn't out of the ordinary because the infant mortality was so high. People did insure their children just in case they passed away and they had to pay for a funeral. But they had some other difficulties in their life. So the house that they had, well, it caught on fire and burnt to the ground. That is a significant event because of the Chicago fire that happened just more than 10 years previous. It was rare for houses now to burn to the ground because of the raise-in codes and also the response of the fire brigade. So this must have been quite the fire to prevent the fire brigade from extinguish it before it was totally destroyed. But fortunately for Bella and Mads, they got a significant insurance payment, which they decided we're going to invest in a lolly shop, a candy store. So they began selling confectionery to children, and they had their house there as well. It's just odd, but for whatever reason, the business isn't going very well. Some people say, well, who would want to buy candy from Bella, considering her stern look and her grotesqueness? As I say, the photos I've seen do not paint that picture. I would suggest here that it had nothing to do with Bella and the way she was treating her customers. It was more the fact that these two didn't seem to really grasp business very well. They knew how to get money, but not necessarily how to hold on to it. So it is odd that only 8 months into this business, though, that is starting to struggle, a fire happens and it also is burnt to the ground. And again, they do receive a sizable insurance payout. Now, as I said, they were either really bad at business or they were very good at insurance claims. But as stated, they adopted a couple of children who also passed away. But then another situation occurred where Bella was in the employment, working as a domestic in a house, and the person she's working for starts to get really, really ill. And so Bella organizes that if the worst happens to this poor woman, that she will take custody of their baby daughter, Jenny. And the woman passes away not long after this agreement. Now, it's said that the husband, so this woman wasn't on her own. The husband, he's distraught and just lets that happen. Once he gets his life back together and he's remarried, he goes, well, I want my daughter back. This goes to court, and Bella and Mads win the case, and they maintain custody of Jenny. You'd think that that's really odd, except Mads and Bella was the only parents that Jenny had ever known. And like that niece that probably didn't want to be adopted by Bella, Jenny going back to someone that she didn't know, I could understand why a judge would say, well, look, she's going okay. These people are working, they're making money. She'll have a good life. And she's already formed that child-parent bond. So, yeah, have at it. But then sometime in the 1890s, Mads and Bella get an opportunity that seems outstanding. There's a mining company that's looking for prospectors to go out and try and find some decent mining opportunities. Not only that, they're prepared to pay you to go out there and do so. And any mine that you find, well, you will get 25% of all profits that come from that for the life of the mine. They're going to pay you a salary while you're out there. And they say to Bella, look, because you're not going to have a husband with you for probably 12 months, we're going to pay you a salary as well. The only thing is we need a little bit of initial investment. So you'll have to put up about $700 and a bit more. But you're going to see a lot more back. You will be in some of the top tier of wealth. Well, does that sound a bit too good to be true situation? Well, unfortunately for them, it was. This was an obvious scam, and they fell for it. They soon realized when they went to the train station for Mads to head out west, there was nobody there, but their money was gone. They did not take this lying down. They took these people to court and they'd put up $700 surety against their house. Well, they got that money back. Now, I would say, well, that was a win. But I think this was the triggering point for Bella. I think she believed that all this money was going to come their way. And I'm sure we've all been in that situation where you think you're going to have something, and maybe it's money, and you've spent it before you got it. And if that gets taken away, well, that's rather devastating, isn't it? Well, I think in Bella's mind, she could see the life that she always wanted by going to the United States, being totally free of this life of poverty and living as the wealthy do. Now she had to come up with a way of getting it. So they resort back to something that they knew how to make money. Their house again catches on fire. And it's funny because the fire brigade get there. They put the fire out. And Bella is standing there saying, well, what are we going to do now? We're homeless. And the fire brigade go, you're not homeless. We caught this. Just a little bit of damage, maybe a bit of smoke damage, but no, you can still live in that. Well, all of a sudden, now they've got $650 worth of home and contents, which the insurance company paid them for all the damages inside. That was a lot of home contents back in those days. But if you thought the Brunhild Bella story was wild at this point, with 3 significant fires in their lives, a couple of tragic deaths of babies, quite a lot of insurance money rolling in, well, settle in, because now it really starts to get wild. Mads returns home from work. Bella says with a raging headache. Now we only have her word that he had this raging headache. Now she says she gave him a powdered medication. So back then you didn't always have tablets. So the chemist would dispense their medications in this little paper, and it was a powder, and you'd pour it into a drink or maybe just shove it in, whatever you had to do. So she gives him this medication to help him with his headache. He goes upstairs. Next time she sees him, he's still lying on the bed, fully clothed, but he's no longer breathing. And so she sends for the doctor. I believe she wakes up Jenny and says, go and get a doctor. The doctor turns up and looks at it and says, well, yeah, old mate's dead. This isn't good. What on earth did you give him? And she said, I gave him one of these powders. It maybe got mixed up somehow. He goes, well, where's the paper that the medication was in? Oh, well, I don't have it anymore. I threw it away. This doctor is suspecting poison. But then Mads's doctor turns up a bit later and investigates the scene and says, no, it's all wrong. It's not poisoning. He had an enlarged heart. And so Mads apparently had high blood pressure, and supposedly if you have high blood pressure, you have a larger heart. And he said his heart just gave out. And so it was determined that that was the cause of death. Except there was a really intriguing little detail to this death. You see, Bella had suggested to Mads, look, you've got a $2,000 life insurance policy. That's probably not going to cover it for us. So how about we increase it? We'll get another policy for $3,000, and I found a good deal with another company. Now, this part's not suspicious. I get it totally. If you are letting an insurance policy lapse, well, you want some coverage, like between times. Because, say it's life insurance, just say you're going to make the cutoff midnight on a particular day. And someone dies, say, around 11:30 p.m. Could you imagine the two insurance companies fighting like cats and dogs over the exact time of death, trying to prove who was going to pay up? They'd say, well, the doctor only got there at 12:30, but he was already dead at 11:30. And then the other one's, oh yeah, but he was pronounced dead at 12:30, so you're paying up. It would be an absolute mess. So it made sense that they left a whole day crossover. What is absolutely coincidental is that Mads died on that very day when two insurance policies were active. So instead of not just getting the $2,000 of the original policy, she got both and got a payout of $5,000. And there were media reports, articles in the newspaper saying how fortunate this poor widow now was with a couple of adopted kids and Jenny as well that they'd got custody of. So with 3 kids, she's fortunate to get all this money paid out. Now, people say that, well, after 16 years of marriage, she moved on pretty fast, but you would have to move on pretty fast. She didn't have the opportunity to just wallow away in pity, even if that was an honest mistake with Mads, though I think we can safely say now that it wasn't. This was definitely a escalation in her crimes to get money. It does get worse from here, so settle in or viewer discretion. You take your pick. But she decides, well, Chicago's not working for me. I'm going to go back to my roots. I'm going to go back to a farmhouse. So she looks to find a farm. And she does, and I think this pronunciation is LaPorte, Indiana. I think Indiana's right, but regardless, there's this little farmhouse. Well, it's not that little. It's a 13-room farmhouse. It, at one time, was quite the prestigious building in the area. It was built by one of the prominent people in the town for their daughter, and it was a good operating farm. But this house had passed through a few hands since then. There was some bandits or armed robbers using it as their hideout. It had gone to a madam, yes, where she housed quite a few women who didn't mind charging men for company. But then it had reverted back to a farm. And so by the time Bella moved there to Indiana and bought this farm, well, 2 things happened. One, she changed her name to Belle, and she settled back into the farm life. But then not long after moving into the farm, Belle does also realize that, well, she needs some help. She's getting older. She's now in her 40s. She's got these 3 kids. Jenny's getting a bit older, but she's probably not going to be useful around the farm. She's probably going off to do education. And the farm work is going to start catching up with her. So Peter Gunness comes onto the scene. Now, this is also where I believe that people misrepresent Belle Gunness, because obviously they get married and that's where she gets the Gunness name. But Peter had boarded in the house with Belle, I should say, and Mads when they were married, so he knew Belle. But he had just lost his wife, had a infant, 5-month-old, and another daughter. So he decides, well, he's going to lump his lot in with Belle, go live on the farm. He'll get help with raising his children, and they'll have this happy life together out on the farm in Indiana. So those two get married in 1902. But it's not long after this marriage that tragedy strikes. Now we have to ask, is it just a coincidence here of what happened, or was there something more sinister going on? But Peter is not around at the time, and his 5-month-old infant child passes away whilst in Bella's care. Now this is not ruled suspicious at the time because, again, that infant mortality. But these two had only been married for a couple of weeks when that event happened. And it was actually only 8 months into the marriage that something even more tragic happened, if you can believe that. It is said that Belle comes into the room in the kitchen and finds Peter lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And the meat grinder that had been up on the shelf had fallen off, hit him in the head, and obviously a mad panic ensues here. Jenny is sent out to get help. And before too long, the doctor is there and pronounces Peter dead. Now this does raise suspicion, for a couple of reasons. The injuries to Peter were not consistent just with the meat grinder falling on his head. It had looked like he had a smashed in nose and other injuries, like he'd been in some type of a fight. And Belle herself had what looked like some fighting injuries on her hands as well, which she said came from just general farm work, which is plausible. But interestingly, Jenny apparently has gone to school and told one of her friends that she saw her mother killing her papa, killing Peter. So an inquest is held, and they go pretty hard at Belle, saying, how did he get those injuries to his face? And she goes, I don't know. She stonewalls that. They bring Jenny to the stand, and her story's changed. She said, I never told anyone at school that at all. And she repeats the same story that Belle gave, almost to the T, which some people believe meant that Belle had been coaching Jenny. So even though the official verdict is mysterious events, it's still ruled an accident, and Belle receives an insurance payout. But there is something odd here. And I say odd because it suggested that Belle was now pregnant with Peter's child. That seems strange considering she's now 43 years old. Supposedly and most likely, to all evidence, had not had children before this. And 43 years old back at the turn of the century in 1900s. Well, that was very, very old and very risky to have children at all. But after the event, she does all of a sudden appear with a baby. And it's assumed it was Peter Gunness and Belle Gunness's baby that they had together. But Peter's brother is very concerned about this whole situation, and he turns up to the farm, and needless to say, he gets rather creeped out by this entire situation because Belle says to him, look, because Peter's brother is saying, well, Swanhild, that's Peter's daughter, had some inheritance coming to him that Peter had left in his will. And Belle says, no, he invested that in some other company, and Swanhild is going to be one rich lady when she grows up. Don't worry about that. And because you don't have to worry about her, how about you stay here on the farm, and we can work it together, and we can raise Swanhild. Wouldn't that be amazing? And he goes, you know what, that sounds really, really good. And I'll see you in the morning for breakfast, and we'll start this beautiful life together. But he grabs Swanhild in the middle of the night and takes off, never to return again. And it said that however she approached him, it really weirded him out. And he thought, no, this isn't good. And I would suggest he possibly saved both of their lives by taking that action. But now at this point, Belle has had 2 insurance payouts because of dead husbands, 3 fires, and an inquest into the death of her last husband. Therefore, she would now need to pivot. Still probably not great at business, and definitely not being able to run a farm all by herself. She had to come up with some other plan. So initially, and we don't know the full details here of what the arrangements were, but she puts in a paper advertising for a farmhand, and always it's in Norwegian. So she gets these Scandinavian blokes coming out to the farm. And the first one was Olaf Lindbo. And he's loving life. And he's actually writing home saying, look, I've just found this great opportunity. I'm working, I'm getting paid. These people are treating me as part of the family. I'm living inside the house. And then his letters home are suggesting that, you know what, this is so good, I think we're getting married. He goes into town sometimes, gets on the terps a little bit, a few beverages under the belt, and he starts saying how his arrangement is way more than farmer worker. They're sort of getting together a little bit more. And so now he's telling people he's getting married and he is going to own half of that farm. But for some reason, despite all this really good things happening for Olaf, he disappears. And people say, well, what happened to him? And Belle says, he just went off home. But his parents in Norway send letters saying, we haven't seen Olaf. And she says, oh no, he went out west looking for some property. He just disappeared. And people are saying, but you've got his jacket. Like, why would he leave without his jacket? That's all anyone really thinks of it. But again, Belle can't stay on the farm by herself. She needs more help. And this was Henry Gerhold. And he also starts sending letters home saying this is a great situation, getting very up close and personal with the farmer lady. And I think I'm going to make this permanent. And he too mysteriously just up and left. And Belle says, he just went back to Chicago. But again, they're saying, but why would he leave his jacket behind? That doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's cold in Chicago. Surely he didn't want his jacket. Now I think, and I'm not sure here, but I sort of get the feeling that she may have convinced those 2 people to invest money in the farm. And then she realized this is quite lucrative. So her next course of action is a slight change of angle. She writes into this Norwegian paper or a Scandinavian paper and puts an advert in Norwegian basically saying, I am looking for serious blokes who want to work on a farm, who have enough money to invest in it. You will be well looked after. And it even said, I believe in there, no triflers bother to apply. So she said, like, either you're serious with some money or don't bother. And it sounded so stern, so formal, and you'd think, who on earth would respond to a request like that? Well, it said that she was receiving 8 to 10 letters a day with people responding, wanting that opportunity. So then she could cherry pick the ones she needed. And this is rather frightening because It's sort of like the Dexter Killer. Now, I referenced him in a Jack the Ripper video and read part of what was found on his computer. And it just sounded so creepy, but some other parts of that I've read, he said he targeted people that would not be missed. Like blokes living alone, not much family nearby, but they also needed to have some cash because he said, I need to make this profitable. Yes, I want to be a serial killer, but there's costs involved. Like any hobby, it can be expensive, so I need to recoup some of that money back. Well, Belle here definitely was doing that. She was finding people who had no real connections, no close family nearby. Maybe they're all back in Norway. But they also had to have a certain amount of cash, which she required them to turn up to the farm with the money in hand. And in some of these letters, and we only know of a few of these, but she would write and say, you need to keep your moving out here secret. It's going to be so great. Then you can let your family know and whoever else, and they're just going to be so amazed, and this is going to be great, and I'm going to look after you in so many different ways. Not just with food, but the nighttime activities will be very good too. And because there was no real pictures, now admittedly, Belle was not as grotesque as many people make out, but she certainly wasn't a stunning beauty either. But she did have a way with words, and she obviously had a charm. So many blokes were turning up. But it was just strange. And we will get into more of the finite detail very shortly, but they would all disappear after a few days. But they'd all leave their trunks, their suitcases behind, and shoes, and watches. And people would say, well, why are they doing that? She goes, I don't know, they just took off in the middle of the night. And so right now we are going to focus on one of these people that came out to Belle Gunness's farm. Andrew Helgelien. Now he had a bit of a checkered past himself, and his family weren't exactly above the level in every way. One of his brothers had a gambling addiction and was in all sorts of trouble, but it's not like Andrew had a totally clean slate. 12 years prior to this, he robbed a post office, and then to cover his tracks tried to burn it down, didn't cover his tracks very well, and ended up in prison, for some time. But he'd been let out 12 years ago by this stage, and totally had cleaned up his life. And his other brother, who was a decent human being, they spent a lot of time together. But when Andrew sees this opportunity in the paper, he thinks, well, you know what, that doesn't sound like a bad life. And look, I don't have much else. I don't have anyone else in my life, so why not? So he heads out to Belle Gunness's farm. But Belle still needed help around the farm with these people not staying. All these blokes turning up and only staying a few days. So she'd employed a local guy, Ray Lamphere. Now, the Lampheres were a prominent name in the town. And Ray's father had been quite a wealthy person, but something had gone wrong, and Ray's father lost it all, became an alcoholic, and there was no money left. And so Ray also was falling down that path. He was an alcoholic. He was addicted to gambling. If he ever won on any given occasion, he would spend all his winnings on the local women. So yeah, things weren't going great for him, but he could work. And so Belle was having him work on the farm. He was living in the house. Now, he was telling people there was more going on than just living in the house. He was living with the woman of the house, if you get my drift. And he was telling everyone around town that. But every time one of these blokes would turn up, he'd get kicked out to the barn. And most nights when they were, or some nights I should say, a particular night, he was sent to Chicago to do some business for Belle. And then he'd come home the following day. And it seemed curious, but when those events happened, the blokes would have taken off in the night as well. Didn't really bother Ray. But this night, when Andrew Helgellian has turned up and he's kicked out to the barn. Apparently he's not too thrilled about that. But Belle says, you got to go visit my cousin. He's a horse trader. Go to Chicago. If he doesn't turn up, don't worry about it. Just spend the night in Chi-Town. It'll be fine. He gets there. The bloke doesn't turn up and he goes, well, it's early enough. I'm heading back home. Well, it is that very night that Andrew Helgellian goes missing and Ray has already gone back to the barn. Now put yourself in Ray's position. Every time you go away, the blokes disappear. The trunks stay behind. You ask questions. Often you get the story they've went back to Norway. They've gone back to Norway without their luggage. You couldn't just jump on a plane and say, well, look, I've got to catch the plane and get on there and you're back there in a few hours. You would have taken a boat, most likely, and that's going to take some time, so you would need luggage. But he apparently never asked that question. But it turns out Belle knew that Ray didn't stay overnight in Chicago. What did he see? Well, she doesn't know. What's probably compounding this paranoia in Belle is Axel Helgellian, Andrew's brother. What Belle didn't know, because Andrew never mentioned it, was that Axel and Andrew were very, very close. They didn't go a day without communicating. And Andrew had obeyed Belle's orders by being very vague about what he was doing. And he said, I'm going away for a week, but then I'll be back, was all the information Axel had. So he dug and found out that Andrew had gone to Belle Gunness's farm. So he writes her a letter. And Belle responds by saying, he's gone off to look for your other brother. He may have even gone all the way back to Norway. And Axel's like, that doesn't make any sense. How do you know that? And Belle says, he left me a letter behind. So Axel goes, well, I want to see that letter. Send it to me. I want to read it from my brother's own hands. Because he's not believing this story. And Belle says, well, the bloke that worked for me, Ray Lamphere, he stole it. So I can't show you that anymore. So Axel says, that is not a problem. I'm on my way to visit the farm. So we have jumped a little bit forward there because we need to take a step back now, because after Andrew Helgellian has disappeared, Ray Lamphere is sacked from the farm and he's not happy about it. And apparently gets involved in a bit of stalking type of behavior. But Belle is also spreading some stories about him, getting him arrested. But now she starts saying as well that Ray is out to get her and the children and he's going to burn her house down. She's that concerned about it. She goes into the lawyer's office and wants her will changed. At this point, she's had her 2 foster children still with her, as well as this baby that has just turned up. So she's got 3 children in the house. We might ask, well, what's happened to Jenny? Well, about 12 months prior to this, Belle has told everyone that Jenny has gone off to college. So, and no one can contact her. Some boys were interested in her. They're not getting responses, and Belle's given them the reasons as to why they're not hearing back from her. And that's all good. But Jenny's no longer on the scene. And Belle's only got these 3 young kids in the house. And she tells the lawyer, I want my will to leave all my possessions to these 3 children. There's no mention of Jenny in this will at all. And she says, but if something happens to all of us, because if Ray manages to murder all of us and burn down our house, I want you to leave everything to the Norwegian Children's Home. And so the lawyer says, well, just give us a moment here, because that could mean anything. I mean, anyone could basically rock up and say, I'm the Norwegian Children's Home. So we need to define exactly who this is. And Belle says, no, we don't have the time and I'm not going to bother. Just put down what I said. It's like, well, you're the customer. You're the client. There you go. Norwegian Children's Home. And then she goes to the supermarket or the market, whatever it was known back then. And she does purchase a large amount of groceries, I just have to say. But amongst those large groceries were some significant items. A bit of lollies, candy, cake, and a toy for the kids, as well as 2 large bottles of kerosene. Now, that was probably pretty smart, I would just say. But mind you, I've gone through the supermarket in my town sometimes, and you've got some really odd items. You're just running in for a few things, and you get a bottle of bleach, some cat food, and maybe some charcoal for the barbecue. Now, if someone was looking at you there, they're going to go, Owen, what are you up to? That sounds like a very interesting pub test case, and you might be the star of that show. And I would understand why people would think that. What I'm doing with the cat food, I don't know. But she did hide all these items, Belle did, by purchasing quite a lot of groceries as well. So the purchases themselves that we've just highlighted would not have stood out necessarily to anyone back then. And I'm sure they still had kerosene lamps. So the kerosene also would not have sparked any major thought except for what happens next. Because that night, when Belle is home with the kids, they have a good feed and everything, but she's got new hired help who is living in the house. Now, he never tells any of the stories that Ray Lamphere did about any inappropriate relationship, but he is a younger bloke. His name's Joseph. He said that night he was feeling really tired, so he went up to bed early. He wakes up and his room is filled with smoke. He kicks through the window and then jumps out, and then he looks back and sees this house ablaze. So he grabs an axe and he's pounding away trying to get into the house to save Belle and the children, who he believes are still inside. By this stage, the neighbours have seen something going on, and this is around 4 a.m. in the morning, and they all come rushing over too. But the house has just taken off. It's burning down, and they just have to let it go. But then a team of people are working through the morning, pouring water onto this smouldering rubble so they can start sifting through it to see what they can find. But to their horror, they find what they believe is the basement, what looks like Belle, huddled over 3 small bodies as if she was trying to protect them from the fire. But it's obvious that they didn't make it out. So they arrest Ray Lamphere. Belle had said that he was going to burn down the house. He was going to get her back for sacking him from that job. So they believe that's exactly what has happened here. And the person in charge of the investigation, I believe his name was Smutzer, he was sure that they had their man. He was going to get him one way or another. And there was some strong evidence to suggest that it was Ray Lamphere. He was seen on that property in the early hours of the morning, though he denied he was anywhere near there. But then later confessed that, no, look, actually I was on the property. But I was with this black lady, Liz. She was locally known as the N-word Liz. She was 70 years old. He said we were in a very close relationship, doing things that we ought not to be doing, basically. And she denies that, by the way. She said, look, all he did was ever stay at my house. So we don't know if his stories about his relationship with Belle were true, but Liz here was saying it just didn't happen. Even though Liz, the photos of her, she was an absolute stunner in her younger days, and they say that she was still very attractive at 70. But Ray Lamphere was just under 40. So that relationship on its own would have caused scandal, and the fact that she wasn't white would have caused an even bigger scandal. So I can understand why she would also deny that type of relationship as well, but we just don't know. But he said, I didn't want people to know I was in a relationship with Liz, so I just denied I was on the property. But in his defense, he says it wasn't Belle in that fire. And he's got good reason to suggest that. Because even people at the day said that just doesn't look right. Like, that body looks like it's only about 5'3". there is a detail I haven't brought up yet, but we're talking overall, head down to the toes. They said this body looks more 5'3" than it does the 5'7" or 5'9", and also it's significantly smaller in weight. It's probably under 100 pound, like very, very thin. And now people would say, but a fire happened, and it's true that when you cook a roast, it does shrink. Some people think that's because these days they shove water into all this meat and it's just, evaporates out. It's not true. At least I don't believe that to be true. But when you do cook, meat tends to shrink, but it doesn't shrivel down to nothing unless it is overcooked massively. And you could say, but didn't that happen because this was a massive fire? So that is a possibility. But there's just one detail that may back up Ray Lamphier's story. And that's that Belle's head was missing. And they weren't factoring in the size of the head when they said she was shorter. Now, they assumed the head would have still been there, so they measured that. But the thing is, it wasn't there. It was gone. And so some people would say, yes, but when you get cremated, doesn't all your bones go down to nothing? Well, that's true. But the rest of the body was still there, and the kids' bodies were still there. Like, they didn't lose their heads. So what happened to Belle's head? Was it really her in that fire? They now need to prove that she was the person who was the victim here. And so they bring in a prospector. I believe his last name was Schultz. And so he spends about a week, they say, sifting. So the prospector, like panning for gold, he literally was doing that through the ruins of this house. And he's going and going and going, and then finds this like retainer thing, a bit of dental work. And it had 2 actual teeth still attached. And they say, well, this had to be her. So they take it to her dentist, and he says, oh yeah, no, that's my work. They say, well, we've now found the dental work, so she had to have been in that house. And so now Ray Lamphia is charged with murder and arson. Because with that dental evidence, they say the only way that could have been in there is if Belle was burnt in the fire, because otherwise you would have had to literally have ripped those 2 teeth out. And that is very, very difficult, but not impossible to do. But now we return to Axel Helgelien. He promised he was coming out to the farm. And he turns up. And he catches up with Joseph, the worker. Now, the police have given up all the investigation. They've found the teeth. But Axel, he's not done yet. He's going through the rubble. He's looking for evidence that his brother's either still on the farm, left the farm, and maybe where he's gone. He has not given up. But after a while, he realizes this is a lost cause. And he's probably never going to see his brother again, nor know what happened to him. But then he turns to Joseph and just thinks for a moment. He goes, did you do any digging on this place for any reason recently? And Joseph goes, well, we did. Down near the pig pens, we always dug up these, about 6 foot wide holes where we'd throw the rubbish in, near the pig pens. So Axel goes, let's go start digging. And they do. Start digging away. And before too long, not very far down, they hit something fairly soft. And I don't know how you would cope with this, but very quickly they unearth the severed head of Andrew Helgelien. And Axel definitely identifies, that is my brother. So the authorities come back. They start finding many, many bodies. All dismembered, all with their heads off. And they're not all blokes. They find the remnants of a 16-year-old girl, or at least what they believed was a young girl, who later turns out to be Jenny, Belle's daughter, the one that she got from that couple. And they find that body on what would have been the 18th birthday of Jenny. So she hadn't gone to college. She'd never left the farm. And it soon worked out, with all the trunks, all the coats, all the watches, all the shoes, all the bones, that Belle had been dismembering bodies in her basement for quite a long time. They give up counting at 11. And people to this day still do not know for sure exactly how many bodies were on that farm. But this scam she had been running of getting cash from people was very, very lucrative. And it worked. And she is unique in so many ways as regards serial killers. It is in a vein of Jack the Ripper in that it wasn't just enough to end their life. She had to continue afterwards in dismembering them. It's possible some of the bodies were fed to the pigs as well. That is horrifying. But obviously as well, she had to dispose of other remains and was doing so in these rubbish pits that she would just dump the bodies into. And it's, some people say, how did she do this? How did she overpower these guys? Well, it is shown that some were poisoned. And it's possible she tried to poison Joseph that night when the fire started. And that's why he was so tired. It's said that the kids may have been poisoned, but they definitely were attacked before the fire. But there's also evidence with Andrew particularly that a fight ensued. Remember, he was the last victim. And they found that he had fingers chopped off, a thumb attacked. It looked like he'd been putting up a fight. But Belle was strong. And she could fight like the best of them. And so we really don't know how all these people died. But Belle obviously was prepared to back herself in these situations. A very odd thing happened not long before this, though. Her two kids, the two older ones, had gone to school all distraught, saying that they got beaten by their mother because they wanted to go into the basement. And she said, you don't go ever into that basement, and beat them. And because they were so hysterical over this beating, the school thought the only thing we can do is send you back home, which they did, which I find also extremely odd. Why they didn't hold on to those kids and then go and confront Belle and have a look in that basement. Anyway, that's just me going off on a slight tangent. But yeah, they then all of a sudden found that Belle Gunness, well, she was this despicable, terrible, horrifying serial killer. And her sole motive was greed. She just wanted money. But when this story gets out, this house, this farm turns into a carnival. Literally. There's people selling postcards of the house and the people murdered, and there's vendors selling food, and families are turning up having picnics. The police have to shoo kids away from dripping ice cream into some of these pits where they're finding bones. Yes, things were different back then as regards securing a crime scene. They really didn't have much hope, but I suppose they weren't doing much forensics anyway. But they said 15,000 people descended on this town to have a good old sticky beak around the place. But that added intrigue to Ray Lamphere's trial. Because now all of a sudden, even if Ray Lamphere did it, people are thinking, well, was it that bad? Belle Gunness was not a good person. But the prosecutor highlights very well that might be the case. In fact, it definitely is the case that Belle was a despicable human being. But those kids did not deserve what happened to them. Now, at one point in this trial, one morning, Ray Lamphere is there and blood starts pouring from his nose and his mouth, and he basically passes out at the table. They take him out, clean him up a little bit, bring him back in and say, he's fine, it's just a bit of hay fever, let's get on with the trial. But they bring on someone for the defense, and he says, well, those teeth, I saw Schultz, the prospector, he planted those teeth. I saw him pull him out of his pants and drop him there and say, oh, look what I found. Because Schultz had already testified on the very first day of the trial for the prosecution, and then they go, well, we better find this Schultz bloke and just ask him those questions. But no, they can't find him. He's just totally disappeared. So that's sort of hanging in the air for the jury. And now with all this other information about Belle, this missing head has raised serious questions about whether it actually was her in the house. Well, the jury have to decide. And it's funny that the foreman of the jury asked, can I make a statement before we read the verdict? And the judge said, no, give us your verdict. And so they go, okay, we find him guilty of arson and not guilty of all other charges. And the judge says, well, that's fair enough. What was your statement? And the foreman says, well, there's no point now. I would be really interested. That has been lost. I would be really interested to know their reasoning and what they were thinking at the time. It's just funny because Ray's solicitor, he was aggro about it. He's like, we're going to appeal. This is an injustice. Even though he wasn't convicted of murder, he still said he's totally innocent of this. He did not do the crime. Ray took a decidedly different view. It is odd, but he just said, well, look, the evidence was strong against me. I would have loved to have been acquitted, but, I can't argue with what the jury found, so I'll do the time. And he could served anywhere between 2 to 21 years. And perhaps he took a very philosophical view to his conviction because he knew there was something seriously wrong with him anyway. That bleeding at the trial turned out to be tuberculosis, and he passed away in prison after only 12 months. And some people came out after and said that he confessed to everything, but the confession is totally nonsensical because he mentions that Jenny had a hand in some of it, and he saw Jenny there on the night even, and yet we know that Jenny had been murdered well before then. So I don't really think his confession carries any weight other than someone trying to profit out of this experience. So what really happened with Belle Gunness and the murder farm? Yes, I'm going to call it the murder farm. And you might remember the murder castle, I think, that people refer to of H.H. Holmes. And again, I'm going to state in a video, and I'm going to do another video on H.H. Holmes. He did not have a murder castle. That's a myth. It did not exist. This is a real story. And the murder farm definitely did exist. So what happened here? Well, some say Belle was a virtual innocent party to some organised crime. They were dropping bodies off and she had to dismember them because, they'd done something wrong because Chicago and crime gangs and all that, they were sending them out to the farm for her to hide the bodies. And then they were worried she was going to give them up, and so they turned up and burnt the house down with the kids in it. Except it doesn't really explain Jenny and how she ended up in those pits, and also all these people were responding to ads that Belle had put out. So I think that one just doesn't pass the pub test in any way, shape, or form. The other one is that Ray actually did do it, and it is a possibility. You could see how he could have burnt that farm down. But if Belle was getting rid of him because he knew too much, why did he never say anything? It would seem he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, was very oblivious to what was going on, and Belle took advantage of that and then set him up by giving that cover story. So I just don't see Ray being the perpetrator at all. Another one, and this one does have to be considered closely, that Belle realised that Ray had seen something. She could give him up at any time. Andrew's brother was coming, and he seemed pretty intent on working this out. And even Peter Gunness, his brother, probably could have piled on with some more evidence. And so she knew that it was all closing in on her. So doing what some parents do, which is unbelievable to most of us, she decided to end it all and take the life of her children as well and burn all the evidence. But gave them that one last good night with the lollies and the cake and the toys. Though we don't understand that, it is a possibility. But what the other theory is that Belle staged this scene, which is even more incomprehensible, which meant she had to lure someone else into the house, murder them, chop off their head, kill your own children, and then burn the house down on top of them while you disappear. Now, she had the money. Remember, she was collecting cash from all these people. Well, which one of those theories do you think passes the pub test? Now, before I give my theory, I'm just going to give you some time to think and mention one thing that irks me about Belle Gunness mostly, and that's that we know her by that name. Like, what did Peter Gunness do to have his name tarnished with this story? He was only on the scene for about 8 months and he suffered some major tragedy in that time. But for whatever reason, she's not known as Belle Sorensen or Belle, whatever her name was back in Norway that I can't pronounce, or even Brunhild, but Belle Gunness. I don't know, maybe the Gunness family are happy with it because they can make some money out of it. I don't know, but it's just weird. That name stuck, not the others. But here we go, and I will present my evidence to what I believe unravels the mystery of Belle Gunness and the murder farm. I believe she staged the scene and fled with all the money, but then had to pivot slightly for one last time, which we will get to. But we need to go all the way back to why I believe this. Even when she got custody of Jenny and the person she was working for fell ill, that seemed to be a pattern. Had she already started? Was she poisoning that person? And once that lady agreed to what Belle wanted, then she did away with her so she could take custody of Jenny. For whatever reason, that is a strong possibility. And it's possible a couple of those infant children were for the insurance, but definitely Mads was. And then Peter Gunness definitely was a targeted attack to get money. But then when they start digging into this, she realizes a third husband would send her to prison, if not worse. So she needed to change it up. And then when she stumbled, or rather worked out, this Lonely Hearts Club scam and bringing the blokes to her with their cash in hand, well, that was like the absolute windfall. So she could try to poison them, maybe slow them down, but if that didn't work, she was prepared to fight them. And it would seem that Jenny saw one of these attacks, at least of Peter. And it's then possible, in fact I would suggest highly likely, that Belle realized she couldn't let Jenny live. Eventually she would give up the game. She almost did to a school friend. So she tells the story she's going to college. And she's now murdered in the backyard as well. And yet, she never killed the local hired help. Only people from out of town. Why? Because people would have said, well, the last place, say, Ray Lamphere was seen, was on the Gunness farm. People would have gone looking. People would have gone searching. They probably would have gone to the basement. And all her story would have totally unraveled. And the will proves it to me as well. Remembering she's getting concerned that Ray Lamphere is going to burn down the house, which is a perfect cover story. She doesn't mention Jenny at all in that will. Reason, she already knew that Jenny was dead. So she was planning something here. But when she said, well, look, I'm going to leave it to my kids, but just in case, the Norwegian Children's Home and the lawyers saying this, we need to investigate it. No, don't worry about that. She would have no doubt found someone who could have presented saying, I'm from the Norwegian Children's Home. I'm here to collect on the estate of Belle Gunness. That would have worked if they didn't find all these bodies. Because of Axel Helgelian, she couldn't obviously claim on that estate, but she was able to escape with lots and lots of money. The sad part here is the candy and the cake, which was apparently unique. She didn't often buy those things, along with the kerosene. And I won't go into the detail, but what she would have done to those kids at that point, absolutely dreadful. Now, the height of the body, maybe it could have shrunk. We can't say that with any certainty. Maybe the weight, well, we, again, can't say with any fact that it wouldn't have shrunk to the degree that it did. They found those teeth and so forth in the fire, so they say she had to have been there. Yet, there is debate about that particular dental work, and whether the dentist was in on it, we really don't know. But my point is, if those teeth were found there, some of the skull should have been. The whole skull could not have just burned away. To me, that is totally impossible. So who removed Belle's head? I just don't think it happened. She was seen with a woman earlier that day that had a similar build to her, but a bit shorter. No one knows who that is. But she had a way of getting people to do what she wanted. And I do believe she did. She dragged this person in, probably not literally, but then she was the person that they found with those kids. But Belle had to remove the head so the body couldn't be identified. And then she was able to disappear with all the cash. But is that the end of the Belle Gunness story? I would say no. In fact, I think it did continue on. I'm very, very sure of it. Even though many people will say this particular part has been discredited, I think there's an obvious thing people are missing here. See, after the events at the murder farm, rather heavy-set Norwegian women were being arrested everywhere, and they were having to prove that they weren't Belle Gunness. But then in 1931, Esther Carlson was arrested for murder, and she was Norwegian, and she did a crime similar to what Belle Gunness used to do with the poisoning and murdering and so forth. And so people thought, this could be Belle Gunness. And it turned out when they looked in, there were some other mysterious deaths in her past as well. Now, that would have made, in 1931, Belle Gunness 72 years old. Well, she denies that she's Belle Gunness. And she passed away before her trial started. And people have done research, including the genealogy, and said, no. Like Esther Carlson and Belle Gunness could not have been the same person, because they couldn't have been in two places at once, because Esther Carlson was still in Scandinavia when some of these events happened. Yet, there's an odd detail. People who saw Esther Carlson said that really does look like Belle Gunness. And in fact, in one of her suitcases, it said they found a photograph that looked very similar to the 3 children who were in the fire. People explain that away by saying, well, she could have bought a postcard, because postcards were around of this event. Remember that carnival? So that could have been it. Seems very coincidental. But how do you explain being in the 2 places at once? And again, I think there is something obvious being missed by most people. That Esther Carlson and Belle Gunness are 2 different people. But Esther Carlson passed away well before 1931. So I believe, after all those events that happened on the murder farm, Belle Gunness was able to sneak away. She had quite a large bit of money. But as usual, she wasn't good with it. So that money would have started slipping through her fingers. And her story, well, with all this backstory she's got, I should say, she couldn't get away with doing the things that she did before. So then she finds someone on their own, no family nearby. She befriends them, gets to know their story very, very well, knows all of their family history. She gets her out of the way, and then she becomes Esther Carlson. And so when she is caught later, because she can't handle money very well, murdering for cash, And they say you look so much like Belle Gunness. You've got the pictures of those kids in your suitcase. She gives them the history of Esther Carlson, which they can go back and check and go, well, that story matches up. But it's not the real story of the person claiming to be Esther. Because Esther has no family nearby to corroborate anything. They can contact people back in Norway, but they don't know Esther anymore. The ones that really knew her would be long since gone. So you're talking now of generations of people who may have remembered a particular long-lost relative. So that, I believe, is the true conclusion to the Belle Gunness mystery and the murder farm. Yes, she did escape, and then she assumed the identity of somebody. And she is one of the most despicable and inhumane people that I've ever covered here on the Pub Test, and hopefully will ever cover here on the Pub Test. But let me know what you think of my conclusion to this story. And it is a heck of a long one. There was a lot I had to cut out to keep this down to a reasonable level. But as always, and as I said at the start, I'm very interested to know what you think. And as always too, I really do appreciate you viewing. This is an independent channel or podcast or however you're viewing or listening to this. And so your support in any way is greatly appreciated. And what I mean by that, it's the likes, it's the subscribes, it's the viewing. And those who are sharing this content, that is also greatly appreciated. I enjoy it though, so I'm having fun, and whenever I'm still having fun, I'll still be punching out some content. So thank you for being here. I'm Owen. You've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.